A Jewish man marries a Catholic woman. How many of them make it to heaven? That was really the heart of a question that a Catholic woman recently wrote to me. Her name is Shayna, and she said this: Pastor Mike, I have a beautiful interfaith marriage. I'm Catholic and my husband is Jewish. I was raised that the way to heaven is through believing in Jesus Christ. My husband believes it is through loving God and others to the best of one's ability and also through good works. This has been an ongoing debate for 20 years in our household. Luckily, we can have some laughs about it, but truly, curious minds want to know your thoughts on the matter. Well, I'm so glad Shayna reached out with this question. It's a big one, and I appreciate the healthy dialogue and the laughter, but we'd have to admit there's nothing more serious and sacred than asking yourself, are you going to heaven? How exactly do you get there? What does the Bible say? What do the Old Testament scriptures that Jewish people regard as sacred and holy, the law of Moses itself, what do the New Testament scriptures reveal through the teachings of Jesus? How exactly does one get to heaven? You know, the Apostle Paul wrestled with that question. He was a Jewish man who was steeped in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms. And he was ministering to people who were largely Jewish, who thought it was through keeping Sabbath days and being circumcised and eating the right kosher foods, loving your neighbors, loving God, keeping his commandments, that you got right with God, that you were justified. But Paul has this really interesting argument that's based actually in the Old Testament itself. He says this in Galatians chapter 3. All who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. So if you're relying on the works, your works, good works, to get right with God, you're cursed. Wow, why would Paul say that? Well, he quotes the Old Testament. He says, because it's written, quote, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. What's the problem with trying to get right with God by good works? Well, the path could work if you would do all the works. If you do everything that's written, if you don't just do it once, but you continue to do everything written, then you're good. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you break the law? Well, you break your chance at being right with God. Verse 11, Paul says clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God, because the righteous will live by faith. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, the law says the person who does these things will live by them. Paul's argument is that if you want to go to heaven by being a good person, you better not just be kind of good, you better be caps lock good. If you want to get to heaven by keeping the commandments, okay, but you can't pick and choose the commandments. You can't be pure but not patient, or patient but not pure. You can't go to church but be a gossip, or never be a gossip but don't always make it to church. You have to do all of it. The law of God is like a balloon, and you don't have to take a bazooka to it to blow it up. No, the little pinprick, any little violation of the law forfeits your chance at being right by the works of the law. That's why Paul, deeply steeped in the Jewish Old Testament, says all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. In fact, the Old Testament says this: the soul who sins is the one who will die. And so to your Jewish husband, or to anyone who thinks, I'm going to get to heaven by being a good person, you have to know this: whoever sins just once is guilty of breaking the whole law, and you can't get to God. And this is why Paul continues in Galatians. He says this in verse 13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it's written in the Old Testament, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. Jesus knew that you broke the law, and so he suffered. He did the time for the world's crime. He paid the price that you and I simply could not pay, so that through faith in him, we might be right with God. There are only two paths to make it to heaven: be a perfect person or trust in a perfect person. And because none of us has been perfect, there's only one way that works. This is why Jesus, a Jewish man who came down from heaven also as God, said, I am the way and the truth and the life. I hope you're a good person. I hope you try to love God and serve your neighbor. I hope this day is full of good works, but it will never be enough, and you will never be enough, because heaven is too good and God is too great. So turn from that self-righteous way of thinking, call upon the name of Jesus. This is the only way for me, for anyone, to be saved. Hey, thanks for listening to Taboo Questions with me, Pastor Mike Novotny. You can find even more questions on timeofgrace.org/taboo questions and in my book entitled Taboo, Topics Christians Should Be Talking About But Don't. Just look for the link in the episode notes.